everybody, my name is Elisa. Welcome to my channel Frills and Stitches. Today I want to show you how to line any garment. I recently made a white waistcoat, which is actually a version 2 of something that I made last year. And instead of showing you, my subscribers who've been around here for a while, the same piece again but improved, I want to focus on a different step of the process, which is lining the waistcoat. A lot of you have asked me about a tutorial in which I go a little bit more into depth on this process, and this is it today. Generally speaking, lining a garment is actually not as hard as it sounds. You can line almost any garment. Depending on what you make, lining could be a good route or just facing could be a good route. But a lot of people don't line their stuff because they're a little bit intimidated by it. I think lining is a very good training for your 3D thinking, but again, like I said, it's much easier than it sounds. All you basically need is a second version of whatever you're making. So for example, today I'm making a waistcoat, and in order for me to line it, I will have to cut all of the same pieces that I cut for the shell in a lining fabric and assemble them the same way. So I have two identical pieces. Once I have my two identical pieces, I basically just join them together. And the way to do it is to have them right sides facing first and sew around all of the outlines of the garment. Of course, there's a few complicators coming into play here. For example, do you have armholes, like in my waistcoat situation? And how do you actually close the length of the garment? I'm finding whenever I'm lining something, the easiest way to think about it is that you create a sort of bag. And I know this sounds a bit weird, but basically when I join the two layers of my waistcoat together, I have something that looks a little bit like a bag. I will have to leave one section of the circumference of my piece open. I usually do this somewhere in the center bag in my waist area because this is the less attention-seeking part of the garment. You wouldn't want to do it, for example, in your neckline or in an armhole, because these are the areas that you want to look really nice and clean. The part that you will keep open, you will eventually close by hand. So it's always nicer to have that in an area of the garment that isn't so visible. You use that opening to reach into your garment at any given point and to eventually also overturn it so you have the good sides facing out. So let me show you how to do it. All right, we have a beautiful viscose lining here with a paisley print on it, something a little bit indulging, but still white and minimalist. We also have all of our actual pattern pieces cut from the lining. I added 1 centimeter of seam allowance all the way around. I'm gonna use these pre-cut pattern pieces to cut my lining pieces as well. I'm basically just placing them exactly as I did with the shell. So if there's a fold in the center back, I place it on the fold. And the rest of my pieces I just place as closely as possible so that we're not wasting any fabric. Now, the trick to making sure that the lining doesn't peek out of your piece, either on the waist or the neckline, is to go ahead and shorten the lining by about 1/2 centimeter compared to the shell. You would do that in the length of your piece, doesn't matter if it's a dress, a jacket, or a vest like this. And you would also do it along the neckline. So here, this is my center back neckline. And I'm gonna go ahead and also shorten this by 1/2 centimeter compared to my shell pieces. This, when later on sewn together and lined up like that, will ensure that the lining actually pulls the shell inside of the garment and in the end enables you to have a nice clean finish that doesn't show the lining on the outside. And I'm doing that now with all of my pieces. In this case, this is one of my front pieces. I'm again shortening the length. And for this piece, because we have a neckline and a center front here, I'm also doing this exact same thing in these areas. And the neckline. Now all of our pieces are prepared and we can go and sew them together. So for starters, I'm gonna sew together all of my lining pieces and all of my shell pieces. So I have two identical sides of my garment. Okay, so now we have two identical vests. The only difference is that the lining one is a little bit shorter than the shell one. And now I'm going to show you how to join these two together. The nice thing about this is that it's really quite straightforward. We grab our lining and place it so that the right side of the lining and the right side of the shell are facing each other. And now we're kind of like putting the two on top of each other. Like this. I'm going to start from the center back. And I'm going to place the center back on top of each other and pin it. I'm moving on to the shoulder and I'm doing the same thing. Shoulder seam in the lining and in the shell need to be aligned. I'm then moving on to the front neckline, securing the lining and shell nicely on top of each other so that the shell and the lining are flush like this. And because in the cutting process, we cut back the lining a little bit more than we did the shell, we added less seam allowance, so to speak, in the lining than in the shell, you will see that now we have a difference in the two in terms of how wide they are. There's a ½ centimeter more in the shell than in the lining. And that is what we want. We will now push the lining so that it is flush with the shell. That's going to create a little bit of tension and you'll feel as if the two don't really match up and they're puckering a little bit. And that is what you want. If you've cut everything correctly, this is what eventually in the end is going to pull the shell inside the garment so the lining isn't showing. You can see it quite dramatically down here. I will have to push the lining so that it is flush with the shell in the waist area. And now we have some ease happening here. And that is exactly what you want. So I'm firstly making sure that we are flush down here in the length. And now what I need to do is to distribute the ease as evenly as possible so that eventually it still looks like everything is matching up, even though technically speaking, it's not exactly matching up. And again, that is so that in the end, the lining is pulled inside of the garment. And when you pull the seam while sewing it, you will find that everything still is very nice and flush in the end. And what you can also see now is when I place this down, can you see how the end is like curling up like this? This is exactly what you want to happen, even if it doesn't feel like it. In the length, I'm going to continue pinning until this first bust start seam that I have here. So basically close this corner. Same thing on the other side, ensuring that the center front is flush and then ensuring that the length is flush, pushing the shell inwards and the lining outwards so the two are matching up. So we have this ease right here and then redistributing the ease so that in the end we have the curl going up. Okay, that means we have now pinned the entirety of the neckline, again ensuring the right sides are facing, and I can now go ahead and sew all of this all the way around for starters. So now that this is sewn, what we're gonna do is we will take this to an iron and press everything as flush as possible. Now that we have sewn this part, I'm gonna go in and try to unstitch everything all around the neckline, starting from the length of the vest down here. So this is what the vest looks like now. We have a very, very clean looking center front and neckline. And now I'm gonna show you how to do the armholes. All right, so the armholes are arguably the most complicated part about lining, and that is because it's a bit of a trust the process. So what we're doing is we're still open down here, right? So this section is still open. I'm reaching into my piece and I'm coming out in between lining and shell here in my armhole. What I'm doing is I'm grabbing both of them at the side seams and I'm folding the lining and the shell so that they're right sides touching and that the seams are aligned. And I'm then on the inside grabbing the seam allowance and pulling it through and out in the length of the vest. And this is where I start pinning. I can now be sure that everything, once I pop it back out, is in its place because right sides are touching. And from here, I just start pinning around the armhole as much as I can and as much as the space that I have allows me to on one side. I am doing the front side first. This is, like I said, the most convoluted part of the lining process. You basically just follow your raw edges and try to align them as much as possible. And once I get to this part where it's just really difficult to do, I just stop. Again, I go as far as I can, and when I can't go any further, I stop. And then I do the other side, which in my case now is the back side. The back side for me is much easier than the front side. I'm actually reaching till my shoulder seam. And now what I do, starting from this point, is I place this into my sewing machine and sew along the pinned armhole. So I have been able to sew all the way around. I'm gonna knit my seam allowance a little bit to help the armhole relax a little bit more once it's turned around, making sure not to cut through my seam. And then once I pop everything back right sides out, I have a nicely finished armhole magically appear, or not so magically, because you know, we know what we're doing. And it really reveals itself once it's pressed, which is what I'm gonna do now. And here we have a nicely lined armhole, and I'm gonna repeat that process now with the other side. The last part of making this is to close the length of the vest, which currently still looks like this. And for that, I'm gonna start at one side and turn the vest right sides touching once again. I'm now gonna try to close this as far as I can, making sure all of our seams are corresponding. So here we have the side seam, which needs to match up. And again, lining and shell need to be pinned together flush, even though the lining is a little bit shorter than the shell. I'm gonna go along the back, now matching up the center back seam, and I'm gonna continue going over like this until I feel like I reach a point where I can't go on anymore. We now have something looking like this. This is the most convoluted your piece will get. And that is because we have turned it inside out again until we reach a point where it would be too much to go on. And this opening here allows us to then turn the outside out once again. So I'm now closing the length of the garment on my machine as far as I've pinned it. And now I can pull the outside out again. And now I only have a small part left that isn't closed right here. I'm now gonna press the length of the garment to make it really nice and neat. And then this last part we will have to close by hand. And I will use this moment where I press it to really give it a nice flush look before I then close that part by hand. All right, everybody, this was a short one today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that the process of how to line a garment was made clear by this video. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything else you would like me to tackle. And see you next time. And by the way, if you enjoyed this, please leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so the algorithm knows that you would like to come back here. See you soon.